Thank you. I sound really loud to myself, but people often tell me that they can't hear me. Can you hear me back over in this corner? Good. So I know I'm directing this talk mostly to the students here, and it's been a long time since I've been in high school, and so I don't know what you're being taught these days. So I thought I'd run a few terms by you first just to make sure that we're all understanding. And
I'm going to scoot you over closer to the screen since I can see, so I need to see both you and the screen.
Thank you. So this will be, actually, this will be for both the students and the adults for that matter. It's hard to talk about science without using a little bit of jargon, so I wanted to run a few terms by you to see just what you might know or what I might need to explain a little better. So how many people know, for example, what a carnivore is? It's an animal that eats other animals, right? Predators, sort of along the same line. An animal that kills animals to eat them. There are some carnivores that eat animals that are already dead. So herbivores. Wow, all right, we're doing well. That's an animal that eats plants. Ecosystems, probably know about that. Biodiversity or biological diversity. Not quite as many hands. That's the richness of life in nature. That's species. How many species are in nature, biodiversity? So, for example, an ecosystem with a lot of species is highly biodiverse, and with a few species, it's not so biodiverse. Here's another little wonkier trophic level. A few. Well, I'll get back to that in a minute. How about ungulates? Not so many. That's an animal with hooves. That's a mammal with hooves. Usually a big one, like an elk or a deer or a moose. Carrying capacity of habitat. All right, we're good on that one. That's how many animals a habitat can support without degrading. In other words, sustained over a long period of time. Sometimes we have more animals on a habitat than it can support, and that habitat degrades. It gets worse, and then that population has to crash at some point to come into this new level of carrying capacity. So back to trophic levels. Most of you remember your food pyramid, right? In biology class. Plants at the bottom, things that eat plants in the middle, things that eat plant on top. So those are your predators or your carnivores on top, and then your plant eaters, and then the plants themselves. Very simplified version. Each of those layers in that pyramid is a trophic level, and I'll use that term some in my talk. So hopefully we're on the same page. I'd like to thank Bob Eisenstein for inviting me tonight to speak on what's really my favorite topic, and that's the ecology and conservation of gray wolves. And the question that we pose, why wolves, will essentially be answered by explaining the role that wolves play in their ecosystems. This wolf on the slide is a subspecies of the gray wolf. It's the one we have here in the Southwest. It's the Mexican gray wolf. And it's been the focus of my career for the last 23 years. It was completely wiped off the landscape through wolf eradication in the early 1900s. And we've put them back in the last 15 years into mostly the Gila National Forest area and the forest that adjoins it over in Arizona. I won't be really talking a lot about that program. We maybe could get into that in the question and answer. But what I am going to talk about is an overview of the history of the distribution of gray wolves around the world, the status of gray wolf conservation programs in the United States, and the advances in our knowledge of the ecology and ecological significance of gray wolves, and a special new concept in science called trophic cascades. That's why I had you learn about trophic levels. So historically, the gray wolves were distributed all the way around the world in the northern hemisphere. They were one of the most widely distributed and abundant animals on the face of the earth, particularly large predators. In North America, they ranged from high up in the Arctic to the subtropical regions down into central Mexico. They were contiguous throughout almost the entire United States, except for that gray area in the southeast that hooks onto Florida. And that area was occupied by a different wolf, the red wolf, which is Canis rufus, and the gray wolves are Canis lupus. Currently, the taxonomists think that there are 5 recognizable subspecies of gray wolves in the United States. And this purple area here is the range of the Mexican wolf subspecies. Each of these other regions are different subspecies. There's some new genetic science evolving for wolves. Pointer went dead. Up in this region of southeastern Canada, northeastern United States, there are some scientists now thinking that that's actually a different species of wolf, but it looks a lot like a gray wolf and acts like a gray wolf. That's sort of unsettled science at the moment. So scientists using very sophisticated genetic analyses of skins and bones from museums that they could still draw the genetic material from and analyze it. These were wolves that were put into museum collections before they were eradicated widely across the United States. They use that information to look at gene diversity, and from that they can tell how many wolves they think actually existed. And the best guess is that there were once about 400,000 gray wolves living in the lower 48 states in the United States. By the early 1970s, there were only a few hundred gray wolves left anywhere in the United States. And these were way up high in the Wilderness Lakes region up in northeastern Minnesota. Gray wolves were systematically eradicated from the landscape, from the United States, largely by a federal government program that began in 1915, because we had the attitude back then that predators were nothing but bad. They ate our cattle and our sheep, and we needed to get rid of them. So that we did quite well. And I won't go into all the gory details of how that was done. It's pretty gory, but if you're interested in that topic, my good friend and colleague Michael Robinson wrote a very good book on it's a detailed account of that really, I consider, unfortunate period in our U.S. history where we felt the need to wipe out all the predators. We didn't know what the result would be, but we'll see what that was in a moment. So time passed and human attitudes toward wolves became more favorable, particularly in the 1960s. And in 1973, the Congress of the United States passed the Endangered Species Act, which can be argued is the strongest animal protection law ever put on the books in the world. The overarching purpose of that act is to provide a means whereby the ecosystems upon which endangered species and threatened species depend may be conserved, and to provide a program for the conservation of such endangered species and threatened species. The Endangered Species Act requires every federal agency, regardless of their mission, the Army, the Agriculture Department, the Interior Department, every agency has a mandate under this act to actually carry out programs to protect endangered species that might be living on areas that they have management authority over. And they also have an obligation under the act to actually carry out programs, to design and carry out programs to improve the status of endangered species on their lands. With only a very few exceptions, the big one being to protect a human life. For example, it's illegal to harm or kill a species that's listed under the Endangered Species Act. By 1978, all gray wolves occurring or potentially occurring within the United States, the lower 48, and in Mexico, were placed on the Endangered Species Act's list of endangered species. So bringing it up to today, under that act and under the mandates to carry out recovery programs for endangered species, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, my former agency, has initiated 3 programs, separate programs for recovering gray wolves in the United States. One was for the eastern timber wolf. Remember, that little place was the last place they existed in the United States. By protecting them and allowing them to disperse into new suitable habitats and not killing them anymore, that wolf population has expanded now to about 4,000 wolves in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. That's actually a number that's higher than was set as the standard for recovery. A second program took place in the northern Rocky Mountains in parts of Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming. That program has now accomplished from a start of 0 back before 1995, now has a population of about 1,600 wolves. And getting back to that Endangered Species Act, these 2 populations now have been declared to be recovered by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and they've been taken off the list of endangered species. Their management has been turned over to the state game and fish departments, or whatever they're called in those states. And each one of these states, Michigan and Wisconsin and Minnesota, Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming, all now allow wolf hunting as part of their management of the gray wolf populations in those states. I don't need to tell you that this is highly controversial. All kinds of socio-political issues involved in that, and I'm glad that's really not part of my topic today, because we could go on and on about that for a long time. And then lastly, the third program, the one that I ran for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, was to restore our Mexican gray wolf down here in parts of New Mexico and Arizona, the Gila National Forest and the Apache National Forest. That program is not going so well, primarily because of socio-political issues. We've achieved a population level of just 75 wolves over the past 15 years. There are proposals out right now that are up for review that would change how these wolves are managed, and I'll be submitting my comments, I know, on suggestions for doing a better job. Our initial goal here was to have 100 wolves by 2006, so it's way behind schedule. So let's get into the ecology, which is the fun stuff. You can read what Bill Ripple had to say after having studied wolves in Yellowstone National Park. Once they put them back, the profound ecological implications of losing top predators are only now beginning to be understood. I once heard somebody say ecology is not rocket science. It's a whole lot more complicated than that. And you'll see, there's just no end to the interconnections that surface, and our understanding of those is probably very superficial. For a long time in science, the prevailing scientific thought was that ecosystems were governed by or structured by or forced by processes that occurred from the ground up, the bottom up. In other words, whatever's happening in the plant community controls how many herbivores you have in the system, that controls how many predators you have in the system. That was the prevailing thought until 1960, when there was a very famous paper published by 3 scientists named Hairston, Smith, and Slobodkin, the HSS hypothesis, it's often called, or the green world hypothesis. They were the first to go out on a limb in a scientific publication and suggest that maybe it's the predators at the top that are controlling ecosystems, and that the reason we have lush green forests and prairies and such that are healthy and diverse is because the predators at the top are controlling the herbivores from eating too many of the plants. And that sparked a debate that's just now being settled. For 50 years, scientists have argued and debated as to whether, and done research projects to decide, are ecosystems driven from the animals at the top, and those effects are forced down through the ecosystem, or are they driven by things that are happening down at the bottom, like plant production? And that's being driven by moisture and light and such. Is that what drives ecosystems? Turns out it's probably a little of both, but there's more and more evidence surfacing that these top-down effects are revealing that the top predators, such as gray wolves, can exert a strong structuring force on all of these trophic levels in the pyramid, in the ecosystems. In other words, they exert a strong top-down effect on the structure of the ecosystem. How do they do this? They eat these guys. They primarily prey on the ungulates. Remember our term ungulates? The large herbivores that inhabit the landscape. This is wolf food. Everywhere from caribou in the Arctic to our collared peccaries down here in the southwest, with white-tailed deer and moose and elk and mule deer in between. If a habitat doesn't have these animals, it's not wolf habitat. Habitats that support good populations of ungulates are generally considered to be suitable habitats for wolves. They're not real picky about what plants are growing, as long as there are a lot of deer and elk and such out on the landscape. They're happy to make a living there. Things that degrade wolf habitat are usually related to us, the humans. Roads, which allow people access into areas and result in things like poaching of wolves. Other activities that we engage in, like grazing our cattle on the national forests, directly compete with food for these ungulates, and directly and indirectly compete with wolves as it being suitable habitat for them. One of the issues is that when wolves attack livestock, of course, there's heavy pressure put on the government to remove those wolves. This is a picture of a ponderosa pine forest in the Gila wilderness. This habitat supports elk and mule deer and white-tailed deer, and at a little lower elevation, javelina. And because it's wilderness, there are no roads, there are no human activities in here that really affect wolf habitat quality. So it's a really good place for wolves. And one last thing about wolf habitat is it has to do with the lay of the land, the terrain roughness, it's called, because wolves hunt by running down their prey over very long distances, so they have to have a fairly smooth surface to do that. They can't operate in really rugged terrain. So in our ecosystems out here in the western United States, we have two top carnivores at the top of that peak of the food pyramid: the gray wolves and the mountain lions, or the cougar. This picture on the right gives you an idea of just how sneaky those cougars can be. I turn around and look behind me more often than I used to before I saw this slide, but it's a night camera. It's a trail camera at night, so it's really dark. It's not light, and that cat is so stealthy and so quiet. It is trailing that deer at about 6 feet, and the deer doesn't know quite yet it's there. But another name for these top carnivores that you may have heard of is Keystone Species. And Keystone Species are those species whose activity maintain biological and habitat diversity within their ecosystems. In other words, they have this top-down effect. And here, as I said, in the western United States, our two keystone top carnivores are the wolves and the mountain lions. In areas where both of these top predators live in the same place, they share the same prey species. They eat these large ungulates. But because cougars prey by ambush rather than long chases, they tend to occupy the more rugged country, and the wolves tend to occupy the more even country. And so that's how they divide things up ecologically. So by limiting the populations of large herbivores, these top carnivores indirectly promote the ecological health of plant communities by maintaining more species of plants, a more complex structure in the plant community, various levels of plants, various more species of plants, and that provides more habitat for a diverse community of smaller animals, small birds, rodents and such, mice, voles, you name it. As the more diversity there is in the plant community, the more habitats available and niches are available for a variety of other species of animals. The wolves can limit the damaging ecological effects of herbivores in two very important ways. One is through directly preying on them and keeping their numbers limited and holding them within the carrying capacity of their habitat. And we've seen that in Yellowstone National Park. The elk population had boomed without wolves, and now it's come down to a level where the habitat's beginning to recover. And I'll show you some dramatic pictures of that. The other way that they affect herbivores and the herbivores' effect on the plant communities is by altering the behavior of the large ungulates. Keeping them scared, for example. In areas occupied by wolves, the ungulates are way more vigilant and wary. They're popping their head up every now and then to see if a wolf's approaching their backside. So they don't spend as much time eating, and they don't spend as much time in any one place, so they can't hammer any given plant community, particularly if it's got the things they really like willows along a stream, for example, or young aspen saplings. The wolves move them around, spread their effect around the landscape, so it's not as bad in any one place. So the more recent term for this effect of the top predators is the ecology of fear. It actually affects the way other animals, prey animals, behave. So this is brand new. This is a paper that just came out by the researchers that have been working in Yellowstone National Park, and it gives you a schematic of how this plays out. Essentially, and what it is a depiction of how wolves actually improve habitat for grizzly bears. The wolves eat the elk, they run them around. There are more of these berry-producing shrubs that the elk really love to eat, actually grow up and produce berries, and that produces more food for bears. It's as simple as that, but it's not something you might think of, that putting a wolf into an ecosystem where it's been missing will actually make things better for grizzly bears, but it does. And there's another way that happens too, and that is that wolves kill a lot of elk, for example, in Yellowstone, and the carcasses hit the ground and they don't necessarily get it all eaten up. A grizzly bear can actually bully a wolf off a carcass, and they'll do that a lot and take over their carcasses. So there's a lot more dead meat out there for grizzly bears to eat than there used to be. So the bears are actually doing better in Yellowstone since wolves came back. It's a science lecture, right? This is going to take a while, so I need a drink of water. But I call this the mysterious case of the missing trees. When researchers from Oregon State University, guys named Bill Ripple and Bob Bestia, first visited Yellowstone National Park, they were puzzled by the absence of young trees, willows along the streams, cottonwoods. There weren't any young trees, no young aspens. All the trees were really old. They went on to visit 5 other national parks around the country, around the West, that is, and they found the same thing everywhere. They found missing trees. So to solve this puzzle, they began by taking core samples from these trees and figuring out how old they were, when they first started to grow. So this isn't quite as scary as it looks. These are trees, like this is black cottonwood. That's the number of trees in the plot where they were studying. And the age of the trees goes from brand new young seedlings on the right to very old trees on the left. We can see those trees started growing in the 1840s. So these trees are 150, 160 years old. These are 1 or less on the far right. In an ecosystem that's working like it should, or a forest that's working like it should, you would expect this line to go up like this. There should be a whole lot more babies than there are really, really old folks. But there weren't. What they found was that in every one of these parks that they visited, there was a point where all of a sudden the trees started dropping off. There weren't any young trees. Most of the trees were 50 to 60 years old or more. So they started to think about what could cause that. They thought of the usual things first. Well, maybe there were climate shifts or extreme climate events that caused trees to die in certain periods. Maybe it was fire. But they looked at the history of all that, and it just didn't match the data. And then they struck on the idea of looking at retracing the history to find out when the large predators were taken out of those national parks. And yeah, we killed them in our national parks too. It didn't matter where they were. They were out of Yellowstone in the 1920s and most of these other western parks. So in each one of these, there's a line that goes up through the middle. And that's the best guess at when wolves were present, wolves were absent. Some cases it's cougars. In Yosemite, same thing's happening. They were here, now they're gone. And right after that happened, and of course that didn't happen overnight. There was a graduated period where there got fewer and fewer, and finally they were gone. After that, what this means is all the young trees are not surviving anymore. And remember I talked about Yellowstone National Park, and we started putting wolves back in Yellowstone National Park in 1995. And right over here you'll see this little bar that's not present anywhere else in that magnitude. That's young trees growing back up in Yellowstone National Park today. Following that line, the wolves were reintroduced. Seems to make a pretty strong case that there's something going on here between the predators and the trees. Well, rather than looking at graphs, let's look at what this actually looks like on the ground. This is a picture back in the day in Yellowstone National Park, long after the wolves were gone, before they were put back. You could substitute cows for these elk just about, because that's the way they're behaving. They have no fear because their predators are gone. The bears were hammered too back then. So they're just hanging out. This is a river valley. I'm guessing it's probably the Lamar River. And they're hanging out. They're not afraid. They're eating everything they can get their teeth around. Look at these trees. These are those old trees we saw in those graphs. They're really old. They're not in very good shape. Trees get old and die just like we do. So these are on their way out. And there's nobody coming up to replace them, no young trees. So that was the situation that existed when the wolves were put back into Yellowstone National Park. So just to revisit what we're talking about here, we're talking about this idea called a trophic cascade, where the predators control the herbivores and the herbivores feed on the plants. And so if these guys keep these guys down, we get more of these. When you take these out, the herbivores have unlimited opportunity to eat plants. That's what we saw in that picture, is an unchecked population of elk just hammering the plant community, eating all the young trees to the point that they were completely gone. And there's other nuances to this that I won't go into, but that's the essence of this rippling effect from predators down to the plants all the way through that food pyramid. So fast forward. This is a photo point on the Lamar River Valley in Yellowstone National Park. This looks like that picture we saw before. Big old tree, no little trees. These are little willows trying to grow, but they never get any higher than that because the elk come along and they chew them down. Same with the cottonwoods. 7 years, just 7 years after the wolves were put in. This is 2003. Look at these willows coming back in that system. It's not just where this picture was taken. There's clumps of them here. The river goes back. See them all back in there. There's a landscape-wide effect going on of willows regenerating along the streams. The recovery of the willows has done a number of things. Back when we, at that picture where the elk had eaten everything, they drove all the beavers out because there wasn't anything left for the beavers to eat. So beavers actually were gone from Yellowstone National Park. Now that the wolves have been returned, the beavers are returning. And that has a number of effects. First, this growth of streamside vegetation actually affects the physical characteristics of the stream. It stabilizes the banks so that you aren't always having eroding banks. That makes the streams run clearer. They run cooler because they're shaded by the vegetation. That supports trout, for example, where a warmer water won't support trout. The beavers come in. Beavers have the title of ecological engineers. They completely change the system. They build ponds that provides habitat for a whole other suite of aquatic organisms and ducks. These willows that grow along the streams provide habitat for songbirds. Now that the wolves are back, there are far more numbers of songbirds, far more species of songbirds inhabiting these streamside habitats than there were without the wolves. So this is, and these trophic cascades, this process works both ways. It works in a bad way when you take the predators out. It works in a good way when you put them back in. And so what we're seeing here is the good side of that, an actual real-world example of a ecosystem that's being restored simply by putting the top predator back into that ecosystem. I was curious, this is 2003, so I sent an email off to Bill Ripple and I said, what are the willows like today? He said the willows are doing well. So it's looking even better than that today. So this idea of trophic cascades and top-down effects and regulation of ecosystems is kind of the hot new topic in the last 10 years or so in the scientific areas of ecology and a fairly new science called conservation biology. How a scientist would define a trophic cascade is on the screen there. It's a reciprocal predator-prey effect that alters the abundance, the biomass, the productivity of a population, a community, or a trophic level across more than one link in the food web. That will be on the test at the end of the lecture. All that means is, remember our pyramid? You tinker with things at the top, it messes up stuff at the bottom. It ripples all the way through. That's what he's saying there. This has been shown to happen not only in land ecosystems with top predators, it's happening in the ocean too with top predators. Sharks, for example. And things are just going crazy. We've got more jellyfish, we've got more stingrays because we're catching sharks so somebody can have shark fin soup somewhere. But that's another story that I'm not here to talk about. So we've seen that this classic trophic cascade is underway in Yellowstone National Park. And after restoring a protected population of gray wolves there, we're not seeing that yet here in the Southwest. We just have 75 wolves, and that's really not enough to get the job done. So this book in the middle is if you want a master's degree in trophic cascades, that's the book for you. It accumulates all the science that supports this idea on land and water, that this is a real new concept that's taking place and working in ecosystems. I'll just quote a few things that these authors have to say. We regard trophic cascades as a universal property of how ecosystems function, a law of nature, as essential and fundamental to ecology as natural selection is to evolution. That's a pretty high standard of assurance that we're on to a new idea here. They say a few other things that I don't have on the screen. Of all the trophic layers that we've lost or are losing, the top carnivore layer is the most crucial to the survival of nature. You strip away that predators at the top and the ecosystems convulse through harsh transitions into simpler alternative states. And finally, they conclude by saying, we view the continuing trophic degradation of the planet as a crisis every bit as serious, universal, and urgent as climate change. So if you want to get to know this topic better, I'd recommend this book. It says everything that's in this book, but in a way that you can read it and understand it. Christina Eisenberg's a very, very good writer, a scientist herself, studied under these guys, Bill Ripple and Bob Bestia, and just got her PhD recently from Oregon State University, and wrote a very nice book that explains all this in a very understandable way. But wait, remember I said it was complicated? There's more to the story. Am I doing okay on time? Is anybody keeping time?
40 minutes in.
Another thing that top carnivores do, I might speed it up a little, is they hold all these mid-sized predators in check, just like they do the herbivores. They keep their populations down, so these guys aren't munching as many of the things they munch, rabbits and small mammals and such, and that allows the community of smaller animals to be more diverse and more healthy. Scientists have a really cool term. You can spring this on your science teacher tomorrow. They call these mesopredators. Bobcats, gray foxes, badgers, skunks, and a number of other things. So here's a story about that, another mystery. The pronghorn populations in Grand Teton National Park were going down for years. These guys, we have these in our prairies in New Mexico, pronghorn. The coyotes were preying heavily on these little calves. They're, when they're born, they're like this big and they curl up in the prairie. And my personal hypothesis is they were evolved to look like buffalo pies because that's what they look like, and they're really hard to spot. But the coyotes can find them, and they're in areas in Grand Teton where the populations were going. What's down for you that way? The survival of these fawns was only about 15%. 85% of them were dying before they could grow up, and the population of the adults was going down. They kind of had an idea it was coyotes, but it's hard to do that through just killing coyotes, because coyotes can really breed fast once you start taking them out, so it's not a very effective way to deal with it. But these wolves were put in Yellowstone, and they started moving south, and eventually they got to Teton, and scientists had a really good field experiment right there in front of them. They had areas that had pronghorns with wolves and areas that had pronghorns without wolves. So they did the study, and what they found was that in those areas where wolves had showed up, so what would you think happened? You've got a pronghorn and they've got a small predator. You put a big predator in with that, so now you have two predators. You'd think, geez, these pronghorn aren't going to survive at all. The fawn survival in the area with wolves was 4 times higher than it was where there were no wolves. 60% roughly survival of these fawns. That population of pronghorn is now going up instead of down. Why? Because as I said, the top carnivores keep these guys in check. This was the culprit, the coyotes. And wolves and coyotes do not get along at all, and wolves win. And so they'll chase any coyote out of their territory. If they can catch it, they'll kill it. If they can find their dens, they'll dig them up. And they just don't want coyotes living in their territory. So they ran the coyotes out. And these little fawns, wolves are big. And wolves live in packs. And so if a pack of 6 wolves that average 80 to 100 pounds, it's not going to fool around with a package of 8 pounds of meat. That doesn't go very far. So they're focused on the big ones. Pronghorn, when they grow up, and these guys, just shortly after they get their legs, they can all outrun any predator on the landscape because they evolved thousands of years ago when we had a cheetah living here. So that's what they evolved to outrun. And today, it's no contest. They can outrun everybody out there. So another mystery solved and wolves came to the rescue again. One last thing, we talked about it a little bit before, is wolves leave a lot of dead meat laying around on the ground, and there are a lot of things that like to eat that. Eagles, all kinds of eagles, golden eagles, bald eagles, vultures in the summertime, ravens and magpies and grizzly bears and black bears and 50 or 100 species of beetles and weasels and you name it. Foxes all come and try to get some meat off these carcasses. And once the wolves are gone and there's still some little bit of meat on the bones, somebody comes in to clean that up. It really helps a lot of species in terms of having a more steady food supply. The ravens are an interesting aspect of this story. In areas occupied by wolves, ravens find carcasses of dead animals significantly faster than they do in areas that don't have wolves. The ravens have learned to follow wolves around to increase their chances of finding food. So they just follow the wolves till the wolves kill something, and they swoop down and free food. So one last little complication, not really a complication, but another way to think about this is this idea, and this is fairly new, ecologically effective populations. Michael Soule, a prominent conservation biologist, came up with this idea. A few wolves on a landscape doesn't change anything. You really need large populations that are in stable populations. This is a big pack in Yellowstone National Park. You need them spread widely across the landscape so they can do their job. They can do what they're supposed to do in ecosystems. And we're about to wrap this up. This is from that book. We need predators. We need wolves and mountain lions everywhere in North America. This should be our conservation imperative. We should be striving to do this, to fix our ecosystems. And these guys that I just quoted weren't the first scientists to think of this idea. I expect there are people here who have heard of a guy named Aldo Leopold. Anybody heard of him? He was a famous conservationist. He came to this part of the country in 1909 as a forester. And he was a very smart thinker, way ahead of his time. 70 years ago, this is what he said about all species for that matter, but he was talking about wolves here too. A species must be saved in many places if it's to be saved at all. We can't have just little postage stamps of habitat around. It's like little wild zoos that aren't getting us anywhere. So if we'd only listened to Leopold back then, we'd have a lot less work to do to restore our ecosystems. That's the end of my story.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. We have time for a few questions. Maybe hear from the young people first. Yeah.
When you were talking about in Yellowstone, wouldn't eventually the plant populations not be able to support the sheep, and then the sheep would die off and give the plants to recover? Wouldn't that happen eventually?
Let's see, run that by me one more time.
So the sheep populations would grow bigger because they're not being held in check. So the plant populations would grow smaller, and therefore the sheep populations would grow smaller. Wouldn't that happen eventually?
Are you saying sheep? Is that what you're saying?
No, sorry, not sheep. What is it? Elk, thanks.
Well, if you take the wolves out, then the elk don't have anybody keeping them in check. They multiply. And then they start eating more plants than they should, and they actually destroy their own food base. Like you go into the refrigerator and you eat everything in the refrigerator. And when the refrigerator is empty and nobody puts any back in there, you're going to go hungry. So it's kind of like that. You want to keep those plant eaters at a level where the plants can keep up with them, let's put it that way, and reach a stable situation. That's what it's all about. We had one over here.
What's being done currently to protect our really fragile Mexican gray population in Gila? And what, as citizens of New Mexico, can we do to help that?
Oh, glad you asked. There are proposals out right now from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. One would take all the gray wolves in the entire country off the endangered species list for good in places other than those two places I showed. The other, and the Mexican wolf would go with that, but they recognize that it's a unique subspecies and that it's still in danger of extinction, so at the same time they're going to put it back on the list. And in doing so, it's coming under a new listing regulation, so they have to rewrite the rules for how they're going to manage that population. And that's all out right now for public review. And there will be a public hearing on that in Albuquerque, one of only a few across the whole country, next week. Is that next week already? The 20th of November, Wednesday night at the Embassy Suites in Albuquerque at 6 p.m. Groups that I support are going to be there with a room of our own starting at 4 p.m. If people want to come and learn more about this whole situation, it's very complicated. Most of the things they're proposing will make matters worse for Mexican wolves instead of better, in my opinion. So we can have our voice on that at this public hearing. You can also submit written comments through government regulations website that you have until December 17th for those. If you want to learn more about how to do that, go to a site called MexicanWolves.org. Yes?
Do wolves eat people?
Occasionally they have, very, very rarely. A friend of mine put it in good perspective. The instances of wolves attacking people is what he called stunningly rare, given that so many people have spent so much time. If you think about places where wolves were never taken out, like Canada has 10,000 wolves, Alaska has 6,000 wolves. Hundreds of thousands of people recreate out there. They hunt, they fish, they hike, they camp, and rarely, if ever, do you hear about a wolf attacking people. Part of that has to do with people not being in their frame of mind as to what food they should be chasing. They want to. Nature's an energy game. You want to conserve as much energy as you can. So if you're a predator, you learn what's out there all year round that you can eat, and you stick to that. So if there's a summer, the people show up, you don't fool with them because you don't waste time trying to figure out that there's something else you can eat. I don't know all the other reasons, but it just doesn't happen very often. And when it does, there's usually some explanation. It's maybe a wolf that's been fed at a campground, so it's got what they call habituated to people. It might be that. In very rare instances, I think there were 2 cases in the 40s where rabid wolves attacked a couple of people, but very rare. Yes.
I have a response to that question.
Sure.
On my way to Santa Fe from when I was living in Berkeley, California, we were camping out, and it was a full moon. And we were camping out on these rocks. In the middle of the night, I was awakened with my 2 daughters and my ex. We were encircled by wolves, totally encircled by wolves. The whole entire wolf family was encircling us, just looking and staring at us.
They are curious.
They were so wonderful. They didn't attack us, they just stared and they paid attention to us. And they were the sweetest things in the universe. And I say to you, they did not attack us. And the other thing I want to say is this. I believe it's the cattle industry that's killing the wolves. So indirectly, it would be really great if we all stopped supporting the cattle industry.
One more question.
Oh, he's in control now. You take over.
No, you go.
Well, I had one down here.
Can you talk a little bit about wolf families and the pack structure?
Oh, sure. Well, they're kind of like us. They have an alpha pair, essentially the mom and dad of everybody in the pack usually. And then some young, they might disperse from the pack at a year or so of age, or they might not. It's really up to the individual wolves and their personality. Those that stay on become subservient members of the pack. They are repressed from breeding. Usually it's only the alpha pair that breeds. And they, through behavioral means, they keep the other younger members of the pack from breeding. Everybody helps in the hunts. Everybody helps feed the pups and that sort of thing. And they really mimic in many ways human family structure.
One more, Steve?
What's the role of humans as predators in keeping the herbivores at bay as far as numbers? And can that be done by increasing the hunting licenses offered at the times?
There's some very good research out on that. The question was, what's the role of, why can't humans take over the role as being the predators in place of the wolves? And some of the answers to that are, one, human hunters affect prey in a very different way. They take the biggest, healthiest animals, usually they're after trophy animals. So they're taking the best breeders out of the population at their prime for the males, for example. Wolves, on the other hand, are looking for the easiest thing to catch. They take the ones that are sick, the ones that are weak or injured. So they're actually improving the condition of the herd, whereas human hunters are, genetically speaking, kind of degrading the condition of those herds. Humans aren't out there all year round. They're not out there 24/7. They're much less effective in their ability to control those populations. The other side of that is that the game and fish departments want to maintain an artificially high number of what we call game species so they can sell more hunting licenses to more hunters. So it's just not there is no replacement to the role that wolves play in their predation.
Thank you, David. So let's see, we've come to the end of this evening's program. There are several things